focus for a few minutes, in 1954, she knew that we were going through another very remarkable time in the history. She recognized that this was another crucial moment in this nation's history in 1954. And many of you may know that was the year that the Brown versus Board of Education decision from the United States Supreme Court declaring that the separate but equal doctrine was unconstitutional. And this was a highly volatile time in the nation. Much focus was on the South with regard to this decision. But as we would see, any of you who know history and have taken U.S. history classes, we know that it wasn't the South that only had problems with this particular decision. And Wilma Dykeman noted this herself. It wasn't just the South. The North was plagued with its own issues regarding race, as we would see over time. I teach this period of history in my U.S. history classes. I teach it in my constitutional history classes. And it especially comes up in the constitutional history classes because we focus on what the United States Supreme Court was doing during this time. And one figure, rather than Earl Warren being the towering figure that we remember at this time, there was one other justice who really was the one who really had significant influence on the court at that time. In fact, Warren passed many things off to this particular justice while he was trying to really get himself established as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And that justice was Hugo Black. Ironically, coming from Alabama, as we know, former member of the Ku Klux Klan, and that is interesting if you really study his relationship with the Ku Klux Klan. It shows you how powerful an organization this was, because not that he really believed in the ideas of the Klan, but he knew that it was the only way for him to actually advance himself politically in Alabama is to be connected with the Klan at that time. And many of you remember that after he was nominated to the Supreme Court by Franklin Roosevelt, this became a very controversial issue. And up to that time, the second most listened to radio address outside of the abdication of the King of England, that time was the radio address given by Hugo Black explaining his relationship with the Ku Klux Klan. But it's interesting that this man coming from Alabama who would make this statement as an attorney there that, he charged $25,000 to cry in court. I mean, he was that brilliant. Pull a tear for a little bit of money. But he just had, very interesting guy, that he would become one of the more liberal voices on the court and would really help shepherd the Brown decision through the court at that time. But it's interesting, after the Brown decision was over, the story is told that Hugo Black attended a party, a cocktail party in Washington, D.C., and a number of people were talking about, this is a great decision coming from the court. And it is quoted that he made the statement, yes, it is a good decision for the nation, but people will die. And he made that statement, and as we know, there was massive conflict that still happened after the court case, and those words proved to be very prophetic. 3 years after the decision, Wilma Dykeman, writing with her husband James Stokely, they published this book, Neither Black Nor White, which Jim gave me a copy of it, and I've enjoyed just kind of going through it. This was one of my first introductions to this book. And while this book has the feel of a history of race relations, especially in the southern United States, it is written in a very journalistic style. It has a very journalistic style. Let me find my place here. I just lost my place. I have to keep my notes to stay on track. It has a very journalistic style in how they went about putting this together. What they did is they traveled through the South and collected stories as they talked to people. And if you go through this, it's just really interesting to go through and just read some of the stories that they were able to collect as they were going through the South, touring the South after this decision, looking at how people were talking about it, how they were responding to it, what they had to say. And this puts her really in the tradition, and looking at how they went about producing this book, it puts them in that tradition with Frederick Law Olmsted, which, his work proved very important to me as I was going through my study, and that name probably rings a bell to most people because he was the designer of the gardens, the grounds at Biltmore Estate, also the chief designer of Central Park in New York. But before he did that in the 1850s, he toured the South, gathering the opinions and commentary from people who lived there, and this has proved very important for many historians on the information that he collected. This style how they put this together and just going out and talking to people, it probably worked to their advantage because Wilma Dykeman, it seems to me in the interviews that I have read and just watching her in lectures, that she had this very personal style and was able to make people feel comfortable. I got that feeling that she had the ability to really, draw you in and make you feel comfortable. My great-grandmother was the same type of person. And this probably worked to her and her husband's advantage as they were touring through the South to write this book. It is an interesting thing about people in this respect, that if you give them the chance to talk, if you're willing to listen to what they have to say and not always butting in, they will talk. Dr. Franklin stressed this to me, as I was doing my research, and he just told me this is just a respect that you should give people. Give them the ability to talk. And if encountering African Americans along the way, she said, it was surprising to me how many black people would talk to us when I expected that they might be reticent to talk with us. We would listen and then go back to the car, she said, and write like mad on legal pads, both of us, recording everything we could remember about the conversations, little bits of language and stories that we heard. And they heard a lot of stories. And one in particular here, I just wanted to point out, if you don't mind. I hope I'm not taking too much time. But one here, a story, as I was reading through it, one that just stood out. They talked about, they didn't name the capital that they were in, but she said that this was a doctor. So the doctor in the capital city of one southern state told them this during an evening in his pleasant paneled library. He said, the South has a way of life the North has always envied. This is what the doctor was saying, I'm quoting now. Conditions have made it impossible for them to copy us, and they want to tear down what we have. They tried once and almost succeeded, but we came back without any Marshall Plan either. And even though they won the war, we won the peace. Now again, they want to destroy our way of life. This is in response to the Brown decision. He went on to say this, what do they care about the Negro, talking about Northerners? They have plenty up there to look after if they're so worried about them. We have real affection for the Negro here. We had a yard boy, and then a woman made some very points about how we perceive people, where people are. And this is becoming even more. I apologize because I could probably spend all day just talking. The more that I've worked on this, some more things just kind of just pop off in your head. And just to see that she was addressing this as early as 1957, they were talking about this. She said, he went on to say, we had a yard boy, Luke, who got hell-bent on going north about a year ago. One day I said, Luke, damn it, why don't you go on? You'll never be any good to us till you get it out of your system. And he went. And it wasn't 3 weeks till Martha got a letter. Dear Miss Martha, can I come back to my job? Can I have my job back? These folks up here wouldn't pick you up if you were lying in a gutter. And Luke came back in the back door. This is Wilma and James Stokely writing what this person had to say, this doctor had to say. And Luke came back in the back door, mind you, and not in school with our children either, but with somebody who wouldn't let him starve to death. Northerners can't understand why Negroes like Luke come back. They're part of our way of life. That's why. They're part of our way of life. That's why. And it's something that we'll have when the Supreme Court is just a memory. So this gives you a little bit of taste of what they were encountering as they went along. Just a powerful story. And I'll come back to it in just a second and say a couple things about about this and this mentalities, because it's a place where my work is kind of taking me in some ways, in the shaping of mentalities, and then what needs to be done to unravel certain mentalities. Dyckman noted that in talking about this book, Neither Black Nor White, she noted that they conducted over interviews with over 300 people. That's an enormous amount of interviews to do. I marvel at their ability to do this. And it wasn't a funded book. I mean, they did this on their own dime. An amazing thing in one interview that she gave, and she talked about this book. Interviewed over 300 people, and as I've pointed out, not just political leaders or business leaders, but ordinary people in farms, textile workers, laborers working in cotton fields in the Deep South. All of this was done. Why did they do this? It was done, as she pointed out herself, in an effort to truly understand the South. And I placed that in the context of what I said about in mentioning the words from Dick Broadhead's speech on the humanities. And Wilma Dyckman said the same thing, that a part of what the humanities is designed to do is to help us gain understanding of other people if we listen again. And I placed it in the context of that. They said they wanted to truly understand the South. In one interview, she said, yeah, they didn't want to be 3-week reporters, these reporters who dropped down into the South for 3 weeks and thought they could gather up the information and then left. No, they were from the South, understood it, and they wanted to spend the time talking to the people. This was an effort to truly understand the South and the reaction to the Brown decision. And it was what provided the impetus for this effort. And as I said, it was written in a journalistic style. And since in some ways I'm talking about Wilma Dyckman as a journalist, this raises the question, what is a journalist? A question is relevant here in light of what we're talking about. Well, I looked at one writer's definition of this, and I think it fits her well in all of her work that she did. One writer, probably something that many journalists today could learn from, I would argue, has one writer defined the role of a journalist this way. He said, a journalist plays many roles. They are watchdogs. That's exactly what Wilma Dyckman was in all of her work, not only about what was going on with people, but what was going on with the land as well. They are watchdogs. They're investigators. This book is really that's exactly what this book is. It's an investigation, investigating what people, how real people, I argue, felt about things. They're investigators. They're moderators. I would take this out, even though I think in many ways she did fit this bill, but in a very classy way. She was an entertainer because her works, her novels, I think, still provide sources of entertainment for many people today, and they talk about it in that way. He went on to say that journalists are also analysts. They are informers, they're editors, and they're commentators. They are community activists, and she definitely was a community activist. I've heard the stories, especially about in the confrontation with the Champion Paper Company here and polluting of the French Broad River. She was an activist. They are agenda setters, and she was definitely one who helped to set agendas. And they're voices for the voiceless. And my God, that's exactly what this book is giving voice to people that we don't ordinarily hear from. This writer went on to say that journalists, when they do their job well, they are servants, they're public servants when they do their jobs with a sense of conviction. And she did do hers with a sense of conviction. And they can, when they do their jobs this way, be protectors of democracy and promoters of public dialogue. And I truly believe that she fits every last one of those categories with her work. She helped to generate public dialogue. Her work is still, I believe, generating dialogue. When we consider her work, Wilma Dyckman filled all of these roles, as I've said, and she filled them very well. In talking about working on this, which was their second book, the second book that she wrote, Neither Black or White, she noted that this book grew out of a desire to write a book about the South and that her husband, James, had for a long time been interested in investigating the issue of race and race relations for years. She went on to say this, and this is a quote directly from one interview that I read, when she said, when we began the book, we would just drive and talk to community leaders. We didn't say what we wanted to talk about. She said we didn't tell them that we wanted to talk about race. We didn't say we wanted to interview them. We just had conversations with them. In the opening pages of Neither Black Nor White, which I later heard her say, as far as the title is concerned, later on, about the title of this in an interview, she said that the title stemmed from the fact that once they did this tour of the South, investigating the South, that she would not define the South as being either black, the black South, or either the white South. And this was a beautiful thing she said, and this was a lecture I believe she gave. She said that there was a lot of gray. She said we saw an enormous amount of gray. And for some people that can be frustrating because people like things in neat categories, but she realized that there wasn't neat categories that we could put all of this in, black, white, but there was an enormous amount of gray, that great gray area. And as a journalist, I believe Wilma Dykeman worked tirelessly to convey this truth of that great gray that exists, that we need to consider. And I think that she did that effectively. For me, the work that Wilma Dykeman and her husband did, especially in this particular book, represents an effort to, one, force the southern region at that time to face itself. And at a time when such an effort was not popular. Because it wasn't popular, what they were doing at this time and how they went about their work. And this is a fact that I believe that distinguishes Wilma Dykeman from many other writers. One writer has noted, one writer has made this point as well, that it distinguishes her and her husband from many other Southern writers. So this was the one thing that she wanted, the first thing that she wanted to do, to make the region face itself. And two, she wanted to open up dialogue with one another, to get people to talk to each other, to listen. In the first instance, this reminds me again, I bring up John Hope Franklin's name, it reminds me of Dr. Franklin and the title of his autobiography, which was Mirror to America. And that title, I think, is just a very interesting title for an autobiography, because what he was saying, I believe, is that the country needed to take a real good look at itself. And I've discovered that nations like people, and I believe that Wilma Dykeman and her husband, especially in this book, Neither Black or White, understood this as well, that nations like people, like individuals, often have a difficult time facing themselves. We do, looking in that mirror, examining where we are and what it is that we believe. We have a difficult time doing that. But it is this ability to face and question oneself that is so important to our ability to move forward. And I think she made this point over and over again in much of her work. And that is assuming, of course, that we want to grow and that we want to move forward. And secondly, looking at the second point here, the need for a respectful dialogue. She talked about that. The need for a respectful dialogue is so important in our society. In an essay that she wrote regarding that one writer, a guy named Oliver Jones, wrote regarding the importance of Wilma Dykeman's work, he made this statement. He said, as a writer of both fiction and nonfiction, Dykeman used her nonfiction to state clearly her beliefs and positions, especially on the issue of social justice. Dykeman's books, articles, and essays have a value in their own right as background and commentary on all the issues that she had promoted. Her writing, he stated further, displays a determination to improve adverse conditions and to encourage, and this is what I find so important, and this is why dialogue is so important, to encourage mutual understanding. And I'm convinced that we can't escape the fact that the development of mutual understanding requires us to have an open mind, to be open, and dare I say, have what I say, many other people say, a civil conversation with one another. We must be willing to face the fact that at times our assumptions about others may be just that, assumptions. And I believe that that is one of the strong points that they make in this book, that our assumption that people held many different assumptions about each other, but they didn't know each other because there was no real respectful communication that was taking place here, and that was so important. So we have to be willing to face the fact that at times our assumptions about others are just that, assumptions, and only an open and civil dialogue can rectify this. Wilma Dykeman was asked many years later what were some of the major things she learned while working on this book, Neither Black Nor White, and she responded this way. She made this statement: "A major concern was that we saw people who really knew better when it came to this whole issue of race." She said, we saw many people who really knew better. Are the issue of segregation, on the issue of segregation, that is. They knew better on this issue. They were people who had reason to care more about the community, but were so reluctant to admit other people into their friendship. So we can be that way sometimes. It's this barrier that we have. Some of these people were educated, financially comfortable, people who were in positions where they could have made such a big difference. But I remember time after time when we were talking to people, an underthread of prejudice would come out. It wasn't overt prejudice. They just didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to touch it. But talk we must, and that was one of the things that she stressed, I think, in much of her journalistic activities, that we must talk. And through her work, not just in this book, but in all of her work, Wilma Dykeman encouraged people to strike up a much-needed conversation. In one essay that she and her husband wrote for the New York Times Magazine in 1957, they suggested, and rightfully so, I believe, that a lack of communication between the races was partly responsible for the bitterness and violence that the nation witnessed in the years following the Brown decision. And it's ironic here, and I say this in the light of President Obama's statement about the whole Trayvon Martin case and the reaction to the comments that he made about this case. And at one point, he specifically said, it is a history that will not go away. And there are dynamics here that we can only understand if we're willing to sit and talk and listen to what other people have to say. And in many ways, the burden, I think, C. Vann Woodward wrote an essay many years ago, and it became the title of a book that was a collection of his essays called The Burden of Southern History. Well, history does have a certain burden that goes with it. Many times it does. It heaps a heavy burden on us. And having a conversation is the only way that we can kind of lift that burden. But it has to be an open, frank, and honest conversation. And I think in some ways that this is what President Obama was trying to say. John O. Franklin, I told Jim this story just a few minutes ago. It was maybe a couple of years before he passed away, and I remember riding in the car with him. My boys and I had taken him we all went to lunch together. We were riding in the car, and he had just published his book, Mirror to America. And I had read the entire biography, and he talked about his brother's time in the military and how the racism that he had to encounter there. And he really believed that this was the death, what really killed his brother. He said his brother's spirit was never the same after that. This was in the 1940s. And I remember saying to him, wow, I said, that was a powerful story to read. And I said, it was really bad back then. He literally hit me on the arm. He literally hit me on the arm. First time it ever happened. And he said, Darin, you know better than that. You know better than that. And I was thinking, well, things have changed. And things have. And I'm sure that Wilma Dykeman would say, yes, things have changed in many, many positive ways. But still, when we look at certain things, we see how, some things remain the same in many ways. So I'll never forget this story, but it was this moment with Dr. Franklin. When also talking about this, talking about the publication of this book and writing this book and touring through the South during the interviews, Wilma Dykeman also said this in an interview. She said they cited one Southerner who stated, when they were talking with him, said, these people, he said in reference to African Americans, these people we prided ourselves on knowing so well we didn't know at all, when it came to the whole Brown decision. And why not? Because there wasn't that civil, open dialogue that needed to take place between two groups of people at this particular time. He said, these people we prided ourselves on knowing so well we didn't know it all. Oh, we had cooks and houseboys, and we talked to them, but we didn't communicate with them. In short, truly hearing what they had to say is the point that Wilma Dykeman made. As Jim said, I've recently explored Thomas Wolfe's views on race, which I believe were evolving by 1937, evolving views on race. And I've done that in the context of his story, The Child by Tiger, which was a short story that was published in 1937, year before his death. And this is one of the points that he makes very strongly, I believe, in that story, that while this particular character, who is a composite of Will Harris and a real event that took place here in Asheville in 1906 when he allegedly, Will Harris, an African-American man, murdered 5 people here in Asheville. The character, Dick Prosser, in Child by Tiger is a composite of Will Harris. That the one thing that Wolfe points out there is that while he was working with this particular family, they really didn't know him. They didn't know him. How could he do this? Because there hadn't been, and it's interesting that the children knew him a lot better than the adults knew him, because they were having that conversation. They were listening to what he had to say. My great-grandmother, and I couldn't help, when I watched this interview that Wilma Dykeman gave, couldn't help but think of my great-grandmother. This beautiful woman who lived in West Asheville. Grew up with her. I was telling a friend earlier today that she was one of these ladies. If I were to show you a picture of her, you would be hard-pressed to know that she was African-American. But by the way that we defined race in this country, the one drop, made her African-American. And she had been raised in Johnson City, Tennessee, and then they moved to Asheville. And it's a remarkable woman. I just didn't have I wasn't in the frame of mind of a historian when I was growing up with her. She was just my great-grandmother. We called her Granny. All of us would fight to sit with her in church. When we go to church, when we stay with my grandparents, you were fighting to sit with Granny because, she was going to if you wanted to go to sleep, she'd let you go to sleep. My grandparents wouldn't do that, and then she would give you candy and all of that. So Granny was just great. I never heard her say a racist or anything out of anger about her experiences all through the course of her life. But I didn't know, now I know why she was so meticulous in everything that she did. She was just meticulous. And I was telling a friend today, and a friend of mine, she said, "You're kidding me." But she would iron. When you go into the kitchen, she ironed everything. All of the clothes were ironed. She ironed the sheets that went on the bed before they were folded up and put in the linen closet. I mean, who does that? But she did that. Why did she do that? Because that was her job. She was a washerwoman. That's what she did to earn money, to provide for her family in those very hard years back in the early part of the 20th century. But I never talked to her about any of this. I wish I had, but I reflect on it now and I see, what it was that she was doing. But to me, she was this remarkable woman. And after she passed away, after my grandmother passed away and we were going through my grandmother's things, my grandfather had just this slew of photographs, which my department chair is going to try to get me to get my mom to, at least give to the university over here to have access. He got these enormous collection of photos that he had taken over his lifetime. That there was a picture of my great-grandmother with the family that she worked for. And they're all pictured in the picture. And I wish I had it here. You see it. Everybody is pictured, and when you flipped it around, everybody had a name except my great-grandmother. And she's identified in the photograph as the washerwoman. That was her identity. So you can see what Wilma Dykeman is saying to us here. We knew her, but we didn't know her. She didn't have an identity to them. She was just what she provided for that family. And to me, I think that is, we miss something when we don't realize, there was so much more to who she was as an individual. And I'm encouraging here, I guess, us not to do that today, because I believe that this is a lot of what Wilma Dykeman was trying to do in her work. While we're far removed from this period that I'm kind of talking about, the 1950s, when this book was published, we're far removed from this. We still need, there is still a need, I believe, in our society for communication, for respectful communication, especially when we look at what is going on in Washington, D.C. right now. We have leaders who are behaving very badly. And so we had a conversation off of Dan. I know I keep talking about Dan, but he's here. We're trying to get Dan to run. There's a number of us in the office who are now ready to get Dan to run for governor. So we think he could help us with this. But we have leaders who are behaving very badly. But they need to set an example. And they really need to set an example. And I believe that Wilma Dykeman was saying that these leaders need to set an example when she talked about people who could have really made a difference, but they didn't. You know, they're setting the tone for where we're going, where our society goes. So leaders need to at least adhere to this idea of respectful communication. Continuing with this theme, a theme that was fueled by Wilma Dykeman's desire to get us to recognize and respect our common humanity. That's what she was attempting to do, I believe. I just love the way that she and her husband drew this book, Neither Black or White, to a close. They included 2 quotes that are in there about the value of meeting and truly communicating with other people, and I believe it's what she did in all of her journalistic activities. And these are quotes. They're not their quotes, but they're quotes that they had gathered, and I believe that they really can make sense to us here and what it is that I've been trying to say. And they said they really talk about the need to and the value of truly communicating with each other, respectful communicating. One quote is this, and this is the beginning of the quote: "Travel, even next door, is so broadening. Travel, even next door, is so broadening. You meet such interesting people." And in the words of a French clerk, they included the words of a French clerk from 1606 in the concluding chapter of the book. And it said, and that quote said, "The wonder that far exceedeth all others is that in one and the self-same kind of creature, I mean in man, are found more variety than in any other thing or any other creation." A sentiment, I believe, it is fair to say that Wilma Dykeman held about the land as well. There's such variety in the land, and showing respect for it and showing respect for our fellow man. So with that said, I just really applaud the efforts of the Wilma Dykeman legacy to continue this legacy, because it is a legacy I believe that we will benefit from over the course of the years and decades to come. So thank you so much.